My name is Beverly, and I'm 28 years old. Last Sunday, I was driving down the familiar tree-lined street toward my childhood home in suburban Illinois, thinking about my mother's famous pot roast and maybe catching up on family gossip. I work as a marketing director for a tech startup in Chicago, and these Sunday dinners usually gave me a break from the city chaos. But as I pulled into the driveway, I had no idea that this dinner would shatter everything I thought I knew about family loyalty. What happened in that dining room changed my life forever, and honestly, I'm still processing it all. Before we dive into what happened that day, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for this one, because what my parents said next left me speechless. Let me paint you a picture of who I was before that devastating Sunday. I'd worked incredibly hard to build my life in Chicago after growing up in a small Midwest town. My downtown apartment overlooked the lake, and I'd furnished it piece by piece with furniture I'd saved for months to afford. Every morning, I'd walk to work at the tech startup where I'd climbed from an entry-level marketing assistant to director in just 4 years. My colleagues respected me, my boss trusted me with major campaigns, and I was finally making the kind of money that let me sleep soundly at night. But success hadn't come easily. I remembered eating ramen noodles for weeks to afford my first business suit working weekends while my college friends partied and saying no to countless social events because I was either working or too broke to join. Every dollar in my savings account represented sacrifice planning and determination. My family back home lived differently. My father, Harold, had worked at the same factory for 32 years before retiring with a modest pension. He was a good man who believed in hard work and traditional values, but he'd never understood my ambition to leave our small town. My mother, Shirley, worked part-time as a secretary at our local church, more for the social connection than the paycheck. They were comfortable but careful with money, the kind of people who clipped coupons and bought generic brands without shame. Then there was Marcus, my younger brother by 3 years. Where I'd been focused and driven, Marcus had always been the dreamer. He'd stumbled through college with a communications degree he never used, then bounced from one failed venture to another. First, it was the food truck business that folded after 6 months when he realized he actually hated waking up at 5 in the morning. Then came his attempt at real estate, which ended when he couldn't pass the licensing exam after 3 tries. Most recently, he'd gotten involved in some multi-level marketing schemes selling wellness supplements that nobody wanted. What bothered me wasn't Marcus's failures, it was the pattern that had developed around them. Every time one of his ventures crashed, the family would rally around him with emotional support and increasingly financial help. Small loans that somehow never got repaid. Credit card payments that I'd covered when he was between opportunities. The car loan I'd foolishly co-signed for because he needed reliable transportation for his real estate career that never materialized. My parents had a way of making these requests that made refusal seem heartless. They'd call with updates about Marcus's struggles, always emphasizing how hard he was trying and how he just needed one more chance. When they asked for my help, it was always framed as temporary, always with promises of repayment, always with the underlying message that my success obligated me to help family members who weren't as fortunate. The requests had been escalating lately. What started as $20 grocery money had grown to hundreds of dollars for rent assistance, car repairs, and mysterious business expenses that Marcus needed to get back on his feet. I'd begun to feel like an ATM machine with a family connection dispensing money whenever someone pressed the right emotional buttons. 3 days before that Sunday dinner, my mother had called with an unusual request. Instead of asking for money directly, she'd asked everyone to come for a family discussion about Marcus's situation. Her tone was different, more serious and formal than usual. She explained that Marcus had gotten himself into some real trouble this time, and the family needed to sit down together to figure out how to help him. I'd actually felt hopeful about this call. Finally, I thought my parents were going to address the pattern instead of just enabling it. Maybe they'd realize that constantly bailing Marcus out wasn't helping him learn responsibility. Maybe we'd discuss setting boundaries, finding him professional counseling, or helping him develop a realistic plan for financial independence. I'd driven to that Sunday dinner expecting an intervention, a tough love conversation, where we'd all commit to helping Marcus grow up. I had no idea I was walking into an ambush. The first sign that something was wrong came when I walked through the front door. Instead of the usual warm chaos of a family dinner, the house felt oddly formal and tense. My mother greeted me with a stiff hug and directed me straight to the dining room, where the familiar oak table had been cleared of everything except legal documents and financial papers spread across its surface. Marcus was already seated, looking more uncomfortable than I'd ever seen him. He wouldn't meet my eyes, just stared at his hands folded in his lap like a child waiting for punishment. My father sat at the head of the table with reading glasses perched on his nose, studying what appeared to be bank statements and official-looking forms. The pot roast I'd been craving was nowhere to be seen. No place settings, no Sunday dishes, no warm smell of dinner cooking in the kitchen. This wasn't a family meal, it was a business meeting, and I was apparently the last to know. Harold cleared his throat and began speaking in the same tone he'd used when I was 16 and had crashed his truck into a mailbox. Deliberate, disappointed, and already decided on the consequences. He explained that Marcus hadn't just gotten into his usual financial trouble this time. This was serious debt, the kind that could ruin his credit permanently and land him in real legal jeopardy. The numbers he rattled off made my stomach drop. $43,000 owed to various creditors from a failed business partnership. Marcus had apparently invested money he didn't have into some kind of import business with a friend using credit cards and personal loans to fund his share of the venture. When the partnership dissolved badly, Marcus was left holding debt that he had absolutely no way to repay. The creditors weren't interested in payment plans or promises. They wanted their money within 30 days, or they'd begin garnishing wages Marcus didn't have and pursuing assets he'd never owned. Bankruptcy was an option, but it would destroy his credit for years and still might not eliminate all the debt. He was facing the possibility of losing his apartment, his car, and any chance of financial recovery for the foreseeable future. My initial reaction was shock at the sheer amount, but also a familiar sinking feeling. This was the same pattern we'd been through before, just with bigger numbers. I found myself slipping into problem-solving mode, suggesting practical solutions that might help Marcus manage this crisis. Maybe bankruptcy wasn't as bad as they thought if it would give him a fresh start. Perhaps he could find a cheaper apartment and a steady job to begin paying down what he could. I even offered to help with his first month's rent somewhere more affordable and maybe contribute to a bankruptcy attorney's fees. But my mother interrupted me with a gentle smile that somehow felt more ominous than reassuring. She explained that this wasn't about brainstorming solutions or offering advice. They'd already spent weeks researching options, consulting with professionals, and developing a plan. They'd spoken with their financial advisor, their pastor, even some of Marcus's creditors directly. Everyone agreed that there was really only one viable path forward. The family had a solution, and that solution was me. Shirley began pulling documents from the stack on the table, explaining that they'd already done the preliminary work. They'd calculated my salary and monthly expenses, researched loan options through my bank, and even spoken with a financial planner about the most efficient way to structure the payments. The papers she was showing me weren't information about Marcus's debt. They were loan applications in my name. My confusion must have been obvious, because Harold jumped in to clarify their thinking. Since I was the only family member with a steady income and good credit, it made perfect sense for me to take responsibility for Marcus's obligations. I didn't have children to support or a husband to consider. My lifestyle was comfortable, but not extravagant, which meant I could easily absorb the monthly loan payments without any real hardship. They'd prepared payment schedules showing how I could clear Marcus's debt in just 5 years with manageable monthly installments. They'd researched tax implications and confirmed that helping a family member wouldn't create any complications with my employment. They'd even contacted my bank to discuss increasing my credit limits to accommodate the new obligations. The casual efficiency of their planning was breathtaking. They'd spent weeks preparing for this conversation anticipating my questions and objections, developing responses to every concern I might raise. This wasn't a desperate plea for help. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to make my compliance seem inevitable. As I sat there staring at loan applications that someone else had filled out with my personal information, I realized that my opinion about this plan was considered irrelevant. The decision had already been made. This meeting wasn't about asking for my help. It was about informing me of my new responsibilities. What followed was the most sophisticated guilt campaign I'd ever experienced. My parents had clearly rehearsed their arguments, building a case for why taking on Marcus's debt wasn't just reasonable, but actually my moral obligation as a successful family member. Harold started with the practical arguments. I was making good money, more than anyone else in the family had ever earned. I lived alone in a nice apartment, drove a reliable car, and had money left over for things like vacations and nice clothes. My lifestyle proved that I had more than enough resources to help my brother without any real sacrifice on my part. He'd actually calculated my disposable income down to the dollar, factoring in my rent, utilities, car payment, and estimated grocery bills. According to his math, I was spending money on luxuries like dining out and entertainment that could easily be redirected toward family obligations. The loan payments would still leave me with more spending money than most people my age could dream of. Shirley took a different approach, focusing on family history and emotional obligation. She reminded me of every sacrifice she and Harold had made for my education, from the second mortgage they'd taken out to pay for my college expenses, to the countless hours Harold had worked overtime to afford my textbooks and supplies. They'd invested in my success, she explained, and now it was time for that investment to benefit the whole family. She painted a picture of family loyalty that went back generations, telling stories about my grandmother who'd supposedly supported her siblings through the Depression, and my great-grandfather who'd shared his farm profits with relatives who were struggling. This was what real families did for each other, she insisted. We didn't abandon our own when times got tough. The religious angle came next, with references to biblical obligations and moral duties that I was expected to honor. Shirley quoted scriptures about loving your neighbor as yourself and bearing one another's burdens. She mentioned how disappointed their pastor would be if he knew I'd refused to help my own brother in his time of need. Marcus's contribution to this guilt symphony was particularly manipulative because it seemed so genuine. He broke down completely, sobbing about how he'd only gotten into this mess because he was trying to build something that would make the family proud. The business partnership was supposed to be his chance to finally succeed, to prove that he could be as accomplished as his big sister. He described how his former business partner had betrayed him, making financial commitments without Marcus's knowledge, and then disappearing when the creditors came calling. Marcus had been left holding the bag for decisions he'd never approved, trapped in debt that wasn't entirely his fault. All he needed was this one chance to start over, and he promised he'd pay me back every single penny. The promises were elaborate and detailed. Marcus would get a steady job immediately and dedicate every spare dollar to repayment. He'd move back in with our parents to save money on rent. He'd sell his car and take the bus to work. He'd give up all entertainment and luxury spending until the debt was cleared. He'd even sign a legal agreement documenting his repayment obligations if that would make me feel more secure about the arrangement. But underneath the promises was an unmistakable sense of entitlement. Marcus seemed genuinely confused about why I might hesitate to take on his debt. In his mind, my success had always belonged partly to the family, and this crisis was simply the moment when that shared ownership needed to become explicit. Harold grew impatient with my silence and began applying more direct pressure. He'd prepared a detailed analysis of my finances that was uncomfortably accurate and invasive. He knew about my savings account balances, my retirement contributions, and the money I'd been setting aside for a house down payment. All of these financial goals were luxuries I could postpone, he argued, while Marcus's crisis demanded immediate action. When I pointed out that I had my own dreams and plans for that money, Harold dismissed them as selfishness. I was young and had plenty of time to save for a house later. Marcus, on the other hand, was facing immediate destruction of his credit and financial future. The choice between my wants and his needs should be obvious to anyone with proper family values. The emotional manipulation reached its peak when Shirley began crying about how she'd raised me better than this. She'd taught me to be generous and compassionate, to put family before personal ambition. Seeing me hesitate to help my own brother was breaking her heart and making her question everything she'd believed about my character. Harold's anger was more intimidating than Shirley's tears. He talked about consequences and disappointment, about how my refusal would permanently damage my relationships with everyone in the family. He'd already told my aunts and uncles about the plan, presenting it as a done deal that demonstrated my commitment to family values. How would it look now if I backed out of what everyone expected me to do? The isolation was intentional and effective. They'd involved the extended family in their planning, creating a network of people who would view my refusal as selfish and ungrateful. I wasn't just disappointing my parents and brother. I was letting down everyone who'd heard about this generous gesture I was supposedly making. By the time they finished presenting their case, I felt like I was drowning in obligation and expectation. They'd anticipated every practical concern I might raise and prepared responses that made my hesitation seem unreasonable. They'd built an emotional framework that painted my success as a family asset rather than a personal achievement. And they'd created social pressure that would make any refusal feel like a betrayal of everything I'd been taught about loyalty and love. The most insidious part was how reasonable they made it all sound. $43,000 spread over 5 years really wasn't that much money for someone with my income. I could afford the payments without changing my lifestyle significantly. Marcus really was family, and helping family was supposed to be what mattered most in life. For a moment, sitting in that dining room, surrounded by people I loved who were asking me to sacrifice my financial security for my brother's mistakes, I almost convinced myself that they were right. The breaking point came when Harold slid the loan documents across the table with a pen and made his declaration with the casual certainty of someone ordering coffee. "She'll pay everything." Not a request, not a question, but a simple statement of fact that my consent was merely a formality in their already completed plan. Shirley nodded approvingly and mentioned that they'd already contacted Marcus's creditors to let them know the family had worked everything out. The relief in her voice suggested that she'd been worried about family embarrassment more than Marcus's actual financial crisis. Now they could tell everyone that the situation was handled, that their successful daughter had stepped up to take care of everything just like they'd raised her to do. In that moment, everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't the first time I'd been expected to be the family's financial solution. My entire life had been building toward this moment when my success would be harvested for the benefit of others. I started remembering incidents I'd forgotten or dismissed. Being expected to share my birthday money with Marcus when we were children because families share with each other. Having to contribute my summer job earnings to family expenses while Marcus kept his lawn mowing money for personal spending. Being told that my college scholarship meant I should help pay for Marcus's education, since the family was already sacrificing so much for his less impressive academic performance. Even as an adult, the pattern had continued in ways I'd been too close to see clearly. My Christmas gifts to the family were always more expensive than what I received, justified by my better financial situation. When I'd gotten promoted, the celebration dinner became an opportunity to discuss how my raise could help the family in various ways. My success was never framed as my achievement. It was always described as something that would benefit everyone. Marcus's genuine shock at my hesitation revealed the depth of his entitlement. He'd never seen my money as mine. It was family money that I happened to earn and manage. The idea that I might prioritize my own financial goals over his immediate needs was literally incomprehensible to him. He'd grown up believing that my role in the family was to be successful enough to solve everyone else's problems. My parents weren't manipulative masterminds. They were people who'd always seen my achievements as family assets. They'd invested in my education not just for my benefit, but because they expected returns on that investment that would benefit the whole family. My success validated their parenting and provided security for Marcus's inevitable failures. The loan documents they'd prepared weren't just about this debt. They'd researched my earning potential, my career trajectory, and my long-term financial prospects. They'd calculated not just what I could afford now, but what I'd be able to afford as my salary increased over time. This wasn't a one-time bailout. It was the beginning of a permanent role as the family's financial backstop. I realized that they'd already given my personal financial information to creditors and bank representatives without my permission. They'd accessed my credit report, discussed my salary with strangers, and made commitments on my behalf based on assumptions about my compliance. The violation of my privacy was breathtaking, but they saw it as necessary preparation for solving the family's problem. Harold's growing impatience with my silence revealed his assumption that my agreement was guaranteed. He'd never seriously considered the possibility that I might refuse. In his mind, family obligation trumped personal choice, and my individual financial goals were selfish luxuries that no decent person would prioritize over a relative's crisis. When I asked for time to think about such a major decision, Harold's anger was immediate and intense. Family didn't need time to do the right thing, he declared. The fact that I was hesitating proved that my success had made me selfish and disconnected from the values they'd taught me. Shirley's disappointed tears were equally revealing. She'd been so proud to tell her church friends about my generous gesture, and now she'd have to explain that her daughter wasn't the caring person everyone thought she was. The family's reputation in the community was apparently more important than my actual consent to their plan. The most chilling moment came when Harold mentioned that if I wouldn't sign the documents willingly, they'd have to explore other options to help me understand my family obligations. The threat was vague, but unmistakable. They'd already demonstrated their willingness to access my financial information without permission. What other boundaries were they prepared to cross to get what they wanted? Marcus's final emotional appeal revealed the complete absence of any plan for actual repayment. His promises were vague and unrealistic, and when pressed for specifics, he became defensive and angry. He accused me of being calculating and cold, of requiring guarantees that real family members shouldn't need from each other. The room felt like a trap that had been months in the making. Every emotion I'd been taught to value, every lesson about family loyalty I'd internalized, every guilt button that had been installed during my childhood was being systematically pressed to manufacture my compliance. As I sat there looking at loan applications that would tie me to Marcus's financial irresponsibility for years, I understood that this moment would define the rest of my relationship with my family. If I signed those papers, I'd be confirming that my role was to fund other people's mistakes while sacrificing my own dreams. If I refused, I'd be breaking the unspoken contract that had governed my entire life. The choice was actually simple, even though it felt impossible. I could preserve my family relationships by destroying my financial independence, or I could preserve my future by accepting that these relationships were built on conditions I'd never agreed to. What happened next surprised everyone in that room, including myself. Instead of arguing or explaining or trying to make them understand my position, I simply stood up. The clarity that had been building throughout their presentation crystallized into absolute certainty that no words would change this dynamic. I'd spent my entire adult life explaining my decisions to my family, justifying my choices, and defending my priorities. I'd participated in countless conversations where they'd worn down my resistance through persistence, guilt, and emotional manipulation. This time, I decided not to engage in that dance at all. I gathered my purse and jacket with careful deliberation, while they continued talking about payment schedules and family obligations. Their initial reaction was confusion rather than alarm. Harold assumed I was going to my car to get something, maybe a checkbook or financial documents they'd requested. Shirley thought I might be stepping out to make a phone call to my bank or employer. Marcus was the first to realize what was actually happening. "Where are you going?" he asked with genuine bewilderment, as if the idea of leaving before signing the loan documents was literally unthinkable. When I reached the dining room doorway without responding, his confusion turned to panic. Harold's voice followed me down the hallway, demanding that I sit back down and act like an adult. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was asking me to act like an adult while simultaneously treating me like a child who didn't have the right to make her own financial decisions. Shirley's calls were more desperate, alternating between guilt and anger as she realized her carefully planned intervention was falling apart. She reminded me about everything they'd sacrificed for my education, everything they'd done to help me become successful, everything I owed them for the love and support they'd provided throughout my life. But I kept walking, down the hallway past family photos that now seemed like evidence of a different life, through the kitchen where I'd eaten countless meals while listening to lectures about family responsibility, and out the front door that I'd walked through as a child, believing that family meant unconditional love rather than conditional obligation. The drive back to Chicago was unlike any drive I'd ever taken. Instead of the familiar knot of anxiety and guilt that usually followed family interactions, I felt an unexpected lightness. My shoulders weren't tense, my jaw wasn't clenched, and my mind wasn't racing through justifications and second guesses. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I felt free. My phone started ringing before I'd even reached the highway. Harold's name appeared on the screen, followed immediately by Shirley's, then Marcus's. I let them all go to voicemail, focusing instead on the road ahead and the growing sense of relief that filled my chest. The voicemail messages were exactly what I expected. Harold's anger about my childish behavior and demands that I call him back immediately to discuss this situation like an adult. Shirley's tearful guilt about how disappointed she was in the daughter she'd raised to be more caring and generous. Marcus's desperate pleas for me to reconsider, reminding me that his entire future was at stake while I was worried about money that I could easily afford to lose. But mixed in with the familiar manipulation were new notes of panic and genuine surprise. They'd been so certain of my compliance that they'd never prepared for this scenario. Harold's later messages included threats about consequences for my decision, though he was vague about what those consequences might be. By the time I reached my apartment building, I had 17 missed calls and 12 voicemail messages. The bombardment continued throughout the evening with text messages that ranged from pleading to angry to accusatory. They couldn't believe I was actually going to let Marcus lose everything over money that meant so little to me. The next morning brought calls from extended family members who'd been recruited to pressure me into changing my mind. Aunt Georgia called to remind me about family loyalty. Uncle Albert left a message about how disappointed my grandmother would be if she knew I'd abandoned my brother. Cousin Janet texted about how everyone was talking about my selfishness and wondering what had happened to the generous girl they remembered. The family gossip network had been activated with military efficiency. Everyone had been told that Marcus was facing financial ruin and that I'd cruelly refused to help despite being easily able to afford it. The story they were spreading painted me as someone who'd forgotten her roots and abandoned her family for money. But the most revealing incident came when Harold called my workplace asking to speak with my supervisor about a family emergency. He apparently believed that involving my professional reputation would force me to reconsider my position. When my assistant told him that personal calls weren't transferred during business hours, he became belligerent and demanded that someone in authority be informed about my family obligations. That call backfired spectacularly. My supervisor, Janet, was concerned enough to check with me about whether everything was okay at home. When I explained the situation, her reaction was immediate and supportive. She'd dealt with similar family financial manipulation herself and recognized the tactics my parents were using. More importantly, Harold's call to my workplace revealed the depth of their desperation and their fundamental misunderstanding of boundaries. They were so accustomed to treating me as family property that they couldn't comprehend why involving my employer would be inappropriate rather than persuasive. The escalation that followed my silent departure was both predictable and revealing. My family's increasing desperation as their usual tactics failed exposed the true nature of our relationships and the assumptions that had governed them for years. Harold's attempt to show up at my apartment building was the most alarming development. Building security called me at work to report that an older man was in the lobby demanding to see me, claiming it was a family emergency. When they asked for identification and an explanation, he became angry and refused to leave until they threatened to call the police. The incident frightened me more than I'd expected. I'd always seen my father as controlling but harmless someone whose worst weapon was disappointment and guilt. The idea that he'd drive 2 hours to Chicago to confront me at my home revealed a level of entitlement and aggression that I'd never fully recognized. Meanwhile, Marcus's situation was deteriorating rapidly. Without the family's promised solution, creditors were demanding immediate payment and threatening legal action. His panic was palpable in the increasingly frantic voicemails he left, alternating between desperate pleas and angry accusations about my selfishness. But his anger revealed something important: he'd never actually planned to repay me. His outrage wasn't about losing the opportunity to fix his mistake. It was about losing access to money he'd already mentally claimed as his own. He accused me of being cruel and calculating, of caring more about money than family, of abandoning him when he needed me most. The community manipulation campaign intensified as Shirley enlisted church members and family friends to pressure me. I received calls from people who barely knew me asking me to reconsider my position, based on stories they'd been told about Marcus's desperate situation and my callous refusal to help. Mrs. Henderson from my mother's church called to tell me how disappointed she was in my lack of Christian charity. Mr. Peterson, who'd coached Marcus in Little League 15 years earlier, left a voicemail about how Marcus had always been such a good kid who deserved a second chance. Neighbor after neighbor called with the same message: I was breaking my family's heart over money that didn't really matter. The most illuminating discovery came through my cousin Rebecca, who'd remained neutral in the family drama and was willing to share information the others were hiding. Marcus's current debt crisis wasn't his first major financial disaster. Our grandparents had bailed him out of credit card debt 3 years earlier, contributing nearly $15,000 that he'd never repaid. An uncle had co-signed for a business loan that Marcus had defaulted on, damaging his own credit in the process. There was a pattern of family members stepping in to rescue Marcus from the consequences of his poor decisions, always with promises of repayment that never materialized. I'd been kept unaware of these previous bailouts, probably because my parents knew I'd object to the enabling pattern they'd established. Even more disturbing was Rebecca's revelation that my parents had been planning this current intervention for months. They'd known about Marcus's business partnership problems long before they'd escalated to crisis level, but instead of encouraging him to seek professional help or make difficult changes, they'd spent their time researching ways to make his problems my responsibility. Harold's consultation with a lawyer provided some unintentional comedy in this otherwise painful situation. He'd apparently believed that parents might have legal authority to compel their adult children's financial support in family emergencies. His discovery that no such authority existed left him frustrated and angry, but also revealed how completely he'd misunderstood the legal and ethical boundaries of family relationships. The lawyer had explained that adult children have no legal obligation to pay siblings' debts, that accessing someone's financial information without permission could be illegal, and that the threats Harold had been making could potentially constitute harassment. Instead of legal ammunition, Harold had gotten a lecture about respecting other people's financial autonomy. Marcus's complete emotional breakdown when he realized I wouldn't be swayed was both heartbreaking and enlightening. Between the tears and accusations, he admitted that he'd never expected to actually repay me. He'd seen my money as family money that he was entitled to access when needed. The idea that I might prioritize my own financial goals over his immediate needs was not just disappointing but genuinely incomprehensible to him. His sense of entitlement was so deeply ingrained that he couldn't understand why I'd want legal documentation of his repayment promises. Real family members shouldn't need contracts and guarantees, he argued. The fact that I'd asked for specifics about his repayment plan proved that I didn't really love him or trust him the way a sister should. But perhaps the most revealing moment came when Marcus accused me of always thinking I was better than the rest of the family. His resentment about my success was raw and obvious, mixed with genuine confusion about why I'd worked so hard to build a life outside our hometown. In his mind, my achievements were supposed to benefit everyone, not just me. As the family's anger and desperation intensified, my own confidence in my decision grew stronger. Their reaction proved that I'd made the right choice. People who truly loved me wouldn't try to destroy my financial security to solve someone else's self-created problems. People who respected me wouldn't access my personal information without permission or try to manipulate my employer. The family I'd grown up believing I had didn't actually exist. The love I'd thought was unconditional had always been contingent on my compliance with their expectations and my willingness to sacrifice my own goals for their convenience. The months that followed were a journey of healing growth and discovery that I never could have imagined when I walked out of that dining room. The initial period was difficult, filled with guilt and second-guessing that required professional help to navigate. Working with a therapist specializing in family dynamics opened my eyes to patterns I'd never recognized. What I'd always interpreted as close family relationships were actually cycles of emotional manipulation and financial exploitation. The guilt I felt about abandoning Marcus wasn't natural family loyalty. It was the result of conditioning that had trained me to prioritize other people's needs over my own well-being. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that healthy families don't require one member to sacrifice their financial security for another member's poor decisions. Real love doesn't come with price tags attached. Support doesn't mean enabling destructive behavior by removing natural consequences. The concept of financial abuse was new to me, but it described my family's behavior perfectly. They'd systematically undermined my financial autonomy by treating my money as a family resource, accessing my personal information without permission, and using emotional manipulation to control my spending decisions. Learning to set boundaries was harder than I'd expected. My first instinct was still to answer every call and respond to every guilt-laden text message. But Dr. Martinez helped me understand that engaging with manipulation only encourages more manipulation. The healthiest choice was to block their phone numbers and social media accounts, creating space for my own emotional healing. The decision to spend holidays with friends instead of family was initially heartbreaking, but ultimately liberating. Thanksgiving dinner with my colleague Sandra's family showed me what healthy family dynamics actually looked like. People disagreed without emotional manipulation. Financial struggles were addressed with practical solutions rather than demands for bailouts. Love was expressed through respect and support, rather than obligation and control. Christmas morning in my own apartment, drinking coffee and reading a book without stress or conflict, was the most peaceful holiday I'd experienced in decades. Instead of dreading family gatherings and calculating how much money I'd be expected to contribute to various crises, I was free to enjoy the season without anxiety. My professional life flourished as I learned to advocate for myself in all areas of life. The confidence I gained from refusing my family's financial manipulation translated into stronger performance at work. I negotiated a significant raise and promotion within 6 months, partly because I'd learned to value my own contributions and ask for what I deserved. The money I would have spent on Marcus's debt became the foundation for dreams I'd been postponing. I bought my first home 18 months later, a small but beautiful house with a garden where I could grow vegetables and flowers. Having my own space, truly my own, without any family claims or expectations attached to it, felt like the ultimate symbol of my independence. My emergency fund grew to 6 months of expenses, then 8, then a full year. For someone who'd grown up with financial insecurity and family members who viewed my savings as a resource they could access, having substantial money that belonged only to me was both thrilling and healing. The retirement contributions I'd been making sporadically became automatic and substantial. Instead of wondering whether I'd be able to afford retirement while supporting various family members' ongoing crises, I could plan for a future based entirely on my own choices and priorities. Marcus's story had an unexpected but ultimately positive ending. Facing bankruptcy without family bailouts, forced him to develop real-life skills he'd never needed before. He found steady employment in warehouse management work that wasn't glamorous but provided consistent income and benefits. He moved into a small apartment he could actually afford and learned to live within his means. The bankruptcy process was difficult but educational. Marcus had to attend financial counseling sessions that taught him budgeting skills and helped him understand how his decisions had created his crisis. For the first time in his adult life, he was forced to take full responsibility for his choices without anyone else absorbing the consequences. Most surprisingly, Marcus eventually thanked me for refusing to bail him out. It took nearly 2 years and a lot of personal growth, but he came to understand that my previous financial help had prevented him from learning necessary life skills. He was proud of his ability to support himself and grateful for the tough love that had forced him to grow up. My parents' evolution was slower and more limited, but still meaningful. Harold eventually stopped trying to manipulate my financial decisions, though he never fully acknowledged the inappropriateness of his previous behavior. Shirley gradually began to see Marcus as an adult, capable of managing his own life rather than a child who needed constant protection and support. The extended family's opinion mattered less than I'd expected. The relatives who'd been recruited to pressure me initially were embarrassed when they learned the full story and realized they'd been used as weapons in someone else's manipulation campaign. The few who continued to judge me for prioritizing my own financial security weren't people whose opinions I valued anyway. My new circle of friends included people who understood healthy boundaries and mutual respect. Sandra, my colleague, who'd invited me for Thanksgiving, became a close friend who shared my values about financial responsibility and personal autonomy. Tom, who I met through a hiking group, grew into a romantic relationship built on equality and respect rather than obligation and control. The wisdom I gained from this experience shaped every relationship that followed. I learned to recognize manipulation tactics early and refuse to engage with them. I understood the difference between supporting someone and enabling them. Most importantly, I discovered that saying no to unreasonable demands wasn't selfish. It was necessary for everyone's growth and well-being. The fear that had driven me to comply with family demands for so many years was revealed to be largely imaginary. The people who truly loved me didn't abandon me when I set boundaries. They respected me more for having them. The relationships I lost weren't worth preserving if they required me to sacrifice my financial security and personal autonomy. Financial independence wasn't just about money. It was about freedom. Freedom to make choices based on my own values rather than other people's expectations. Freedom to pursue goals that mattered to me rather than constantly redirecting my resources toward other people's crises. Freedom to love people without being obligated to fund their mistakes. Looking back, walking out of that dining room without saying a word was the best decision I'd ever made. Not because I enjoyed hurting my family, but because refusing to enable their dysfunction created space for all of us to grow into healthier patterns. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's destructive behavior. Sometimes walking away is the only way to break cycles that hurt everyone involved. Sometimes saying no is the kindest word you can speak. My story isn't about rejecting family or choosing money over love. It's about understanding that real love doesn't require financial sacrifice, that healthy relationships respect individual autonomy, and that enabling someone's poor decisions isn't actually helping them. If you're facing similar pressure from family members who view your success as their safety net, trust your instincts. You didn't work hard and make sacrifices to build financial security just so other people could claim it when their poor decisions create consequences. Your money is yours, your boundaries are valid, and your future matters just as much as anyone else's. I hope my story helps someone else recognize the difference between supporting family and being financially exploited by them. You deserve relationships based on love and respect, not obligation and manipulation. You have the right to prioritize your own financial well-being, even when that disappoints people you care about. Have you ever faced pressure from family members to solve their financial problems with your money? How did you handle it, And what advice would you give to someone in a similar situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because I'd love to hear your perspectives on family boundaries and financial responsibility. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life experiences about standing up for yourself and creating healthy relationships. And don't forget to share this video with anyone who might benefit from hearing about the importance of financial boundaries and the courage it takes to say no to family manipulation. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and I hope it brings you some clarity and strength in your own family relationships. Remember that choosing yourself isn't selfish when others are trying to exploit your success, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior. Take care of yourselves out there, and I'll see you in the next video.